welcome you to the first session of our spring learning series. We want to give a special welcome to anyone who may not have joined us for previous series, and welcome back to everyone joining us again. Our series this spring, we haven't done this since we started doing this weekly learning in April of 2020, but we decided to, instead of having a theme this semester, kind of open it up to a best of JTS sort of thing, and giving our faculty the opportunity to present on their current scholarly work, the material that they're most passionate about teaching, and that sort of thing. So we're so excited about our lineup this semester for this series that we've called Timely Insights, Timeless Wisdom. And we're very pleased to Professor David Kraemer for kicking off the series for us, as he has in the past. I wanted to just apologize for my slight illness, getting over a virus. I wanted to just say a word about Israel, because we've decided to start the series. We encouraged the faculty, if they wanted to suggest Israel-related sessions, since so much of our attention is directed towards that part of the world these days. And we decided to front load those sessions. So our first 4 sessions will be related to Israel in various fashions. Professor Kraemer's session today is on the concept of Zion in the diaspora. He will tell us much more about that. Professor Arnie Eisen will be teaching us next week on the idea of home in both Israel and America. The week after that, JTS fellow Dr. Michael Rauscher, who's a professor of Jewish Studies at Rutgers University, will be teaching on the process and experience and important lessons that she's been reflecting on regarding teaching the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on campus today. It'll be a fascinating session. And our 4th session in this kind of Israel-themed beginning piece will be with Professor David Fishman, who will be teaching on the 2 wars, the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, and some of the kind of geopolitical ramifications in terms of anti-Semitism and diplomatic relations and related matters. So that's kind of our Israel lineup, and then we will be going much, much broader to talk about a huge range of issues that, as I said, our faculty are excited to teach about, issues and texts. So that's my brief intro to our series. And before we get started, I wanted to thank all of you for the many, many donations that you made upon registering. And we would love to have some sponsors for upcoming sessions in the series. We have 3 sponsorship levels. Chacham is $540, the Tzaddik level is $1,000, and the Navi level is $1,800. We would love to offer this learning in honor or in memory of a loved one, or a significant occasion or anything like that. So we're posting a link in the chat, and please be in touch if you'd like to sponsor an upcoming session. On that note, I'll turn things over to Tani Schwartz-Herman for a couple of other announcements.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Also so pleased to welcome you to the first session in our new series. And just to go over the format for our session, Professor Kraemer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Professor Kraemer. Since we received a large number of questions, we request that you express your question both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. And we'll also be posting a link in the chat. And we're so pleased to have Dr. David Kraemer teaching our first, kicking us off in the first session of the series. Dr. Kraemer is the Joseph J. and Dora Abbell Librarian at the Jewish Theological Seminary. where he has also served as professor of Talmud and Rabbinics for many years. As librarian, Professor Kraemer oversees the most extensive collection of Judaica in the Western Hemisphere. Professor Kraemer is a prolific author and commentator. His new book, documenting the history of Jewish views of diaspora, will be published this year. And information on some of his other books and publications are available on the bio that is included in the sources. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kraemer.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me, Tani? We're good? Okay, great. So it's good to see everybody. Let me just, what kind of screen are you sharing? I'm looking at my screen. Are people looking at multiple windows or at a highlighted window?
We don't have you spotlighted.
You don't have me spotlighted.
So long, Professor Kraemer, so long as you paused, there was one important thing that I forgot to say, so I'm going to just insert it quickly.
Go ahead.
Which is probably obvious, but I just wanted to acknowledge that anything Israel related is painful and charged these days. You know, and to just reinforce that our purpose here is to learn, not to, you know, trigger people and press buttons and get into arguments, but just to learn in an open-minded way. So just to put out that goal there before you begin.
Okay, good. So I actually just put my own screen on speaker view. That way I would be able to see what other people are seeing, or at least I think that should be the case. Now I'm just seeing you, Julia, but that's fine. It's a great screen. So hi, everybody. It is good to see you. And it's great to be, you know, have the privilege, the opportunity to open up this particular series. As Julia said, we were invited, meaning those of us who will be participating in the series, were invited to address things that we're particularly interested in, that relate to our current work and so forth. And we were also invited, if we were so inclined, to discuss something that had some implications, in whatever way it might, to our concerns and considerations relating to what's going on in Israel these days. So it just so happens that for me, those things went together very well. I've been, I mean, like anybody who grew up in any of the generations that are represented here on our collective screens, it's impossible, where that word is a slight exaggeration, but not much, it's impossible to be a Jew in the world today since the founding of the State of Israel, to witness its history and so forth, without struggling, questioning, engaging, wrestling with questions of the relationship between Jewish identity and Israel in our world. And I have been involved in that, as many of us have, I'm sure, from times relatively early in my life, and certainly in an active way, from the time I first spent an extended period in Israel on my junior year abroad, and then ever since. One of the things that I became interested in, and again, this is a long-standing interest, encouraged by a lot of work that has been done and continues to be done by scholars out there, is the question of the place of the diaspora in kind of the Jewish universe, and the relationship between the diaspora and Zion. As I say, that's not a new interest of mine. I've been working on it for a long time, but I will finally, I mean, I've put together the first relatively comprehensive history of Jewish traditions regarding diaspora. That will be the book that is being published this year. And for today's session, what I've chosen is some very specific sources that relate to the question, or I think the better word is phenomenon here, the phenomenon being the repeated way that Jews have seen Zion in their diasporas. I think this is a very important phenomenon. It's one that we don't often enough pay attention to. I think that in general, the you know, work in recent times has focused more on the place of Zion in the length of Jewish tradition. than diaspora as a tradition, but diaspora is a genuine tradition. And consideration of the meaning of exile of diaspora is something that Jews, who of course have lived in exile diaspora for the large part of our history, there's no doubt that the majority of Jews over the course of Jewish history have lived in, you can call it exile or diaspora, but that's been an important part of Jewish life. And being an important part of Jewish life, we've had much to say about it, including the claim, either directly or indirectly, and we'll consider both of them today, that Zion may be found in diaspora. So you know that much from the title, and I'd like to begin to provide both some interesting sources that will help us think about it and discuss it. But in order to do that, we first have to ask ourselves the simple question, what is Zion, right? Or what, I mean, we could say just simply, what is Zion, or what makes Zion Zion? The second way of expressing it, I think, is actually better than the first, because the question, what is Zion, could be answered factually, but in a way that misses the essence by saying, oh, it's a mount in Jerusalem, right? And as a factual claim, that's sort of correct. But it actually doesn't tell us anything interesting, because Zion over the course of Jewish history has not merely been a place. It has been far more than a place. I think the best way to describe it is to consider it a mythical place, right? Zion is not merely a place. Zion in Jewish tradition is a mythical place, where myth means, yes, something that doesn't quite exist, at least not in a simple factual way. It's a myth is something that has magic, it has promise, it is meant to inspire. There are a variety of ways to describe what myths are and the way they work, but I think that it is fair to describe Zion through most of Jewish history as not an actual place, but as a mythical place. So then the question becomes, what makes Zion Zion? Where, what makes Zion the place, Zion the mythical place? What is it about the myth of Zion that makes Zion so powerful, is what I think we need to begin with. And so I'm going to turn this back to you and invite you to propose answers into the chat. So when you think of Zion, and I say to you, what is Zion? Right? Zion not as a place. That's not the right answer, right? It can be any other answer, just not, it's a mountain in Jerusalem. And the way I know it's not a mountain in Jerusalem, because in Hatikva, right, we end, what we usually sing by saying, Liot am chovshi b'artzenu, right, to be a free people in our land, Eretz Sion, right, the land of Zion, v'Yerushalayim. Not, I mean, unfortunately, in our missinging of it, we often equate Zion with Jerusalem, and I understand why we do that, because we think of them as being identical. But the poem recognizes, and this is crucial, that Zion and Jerusalem are not the same thing. So again, when we say Zion, what makes Zion Zion? I'll keep my mouth shut for a minute. Any of you who have thoughts on that, please throw them into the chat, and Julia will share your responses with me. That'll enable us to lay the groundwork for our discussion.
All right, already a flood of responses. The place where Jews belong and where they can be free and at peace. Heaven on earth.
Okay, wait. Where Jews belong, peace. I got the word flourish there.
I can copy and send them to you also.
No. I'll just get the main terms. Heaven on earth, did I hear?
Heaven on earth. Zion is the Jewish people wherever they physically are.
Oh, okay. Someone is agreeing with me and being provocative by undermining my point. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Ideal state where we are reconciled with God.
Ideal state. Okay.
Zion is, there's so many here.
Okay, good. No, keep going. We don't need to take all of them, but let's just, get a sense of things.
Zion is the inclusion of our collective spirit, regardless of physical / disconnected physical or not lack of physical presence.
Okay, collective spirit.
The psychological concept of home for Jews in the diaspora.
Okay, home, good.
Zion is out of the narrow place. Zion is our being. A blessed world without pain and sorrow. A a longing for redemption,
Mm-hmm.
homeland. Zion is the first step back to the Garden of Eden, the Messiah, also
Mm-hmm.
the gathering of Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, people are saying the land of Israel as well, the promised land, where we will exist after the Messiah redeems us, the idealized land of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
the place that the Torah continually hammers home that we are going. Should I keep going?
No, this is great. This is great. I mean, I hear there's certain themes that are emerging, which is what I anticipated.
Yeah,
But that's great. Perfect.
they're wonderful.
Um, yeah, I mean, I am surprised. I'm going to add a couple of details here, but there are a couple. I'm surprised we've omitted them, but that we have neglected to mention them. These are all, or at least many of them, are very, very broad, very idealistic and idealized. So, I mean, we heard terms, it's like the ideal state, it's the place of our collective spirit, it's home, where home means not merely the address where your mail is sent, but, you know, home in the broad sense, the place of redemption, homeland or promised land, idealized, the place where Jews belong, where they can, you know, peace, flourish, heaven and on earth. These touch the major themes. There may be further down this list. That's why I waited as long as I did. But the two things that may be implied in several of the comments that were made, several of the suggestions that were made, but I'm surprised they weren't rendered a little bit more explicit. Is first of all, the place from which Torah emerges. Ki mitzion tetze Torah, right? So when we think of the formulaic reference to Zion, I think that for many of us, that's one we hear a lot. If you attend synagogue or, you know, other Jewish connected institutions, that's not a surprising formula to hear. So Zion is the place from which Torah emerges, is certainly a major claim. And the other thing, which I think is very important to make explicit, and it touches on many of the things we're saying. We heard about Messiah, redemption, and so forth, and all of that is true. But of course, part of that is the fact that Zion was, in its past, and therefore must be in its redeemed future, the place where Jews most intimately come into the presence of the divine, where Jews meet God, because of course Zion was the place where the temple was, the temple where Jews gathered for all kinds of reasons over the course of the year, where the divine presence would be found. So I think it's important. Also, we shouldn't neglect sacrifice. I mean, the temple was also obviously the place of sacrifice, which was, of course, centrally, not exclusively, but centrally about maintaining the relationship between God and Israel at moments that there were breaches, either individual breaches or more collective breaches. So the sacrifices evoked God's mercy and led for ruptures to be repaired. Again, it's the place of Israel's most intimate contact with God. So I would only add those. But the rest of them are great, and I think this lays for us an exceptionally good groundwork for what I'd like to cover. Julie, are you seeing anything else there that you would want to add before I go on to the sources?
There were a few more kind of less in the messianic aspirational realm, but our heritage and our future. I can't remember if I read that. Sorry, I should just scroll back down. Someone wrote, there's so many. Just give me 1 second. Okay, the center of Jewish life and tradition.
Okay.
And an
underlying, that might be
underlying
Torah and other things.
Yeah.
Good.
An underlying shared history of identity.
Good. Good. It is undoubtedly Zion stands for, you know, the centrality of some common history and fate for Jews. So that's great as well. Okay, good. I mean, I think that's superb. In terms of the messianic redemptive, I would add, since I mentioned certain teachings before that would be very commonly recited and commonly known, the other I would add is the fact that in the middle of our regular prayer that's recited in the synagogue, the Amidah, veering toward its end, but central in its expression, is the repeated statement that God will, and this is obviously in the future, Machazir Shechinato Litzion, right, will return God's presence, the Shekhinah, to Zion. So I think that fills it out. There are other nuances that we could put on this, but I think this captures it very, very well. So let me tell you what we're about to do. There are hundreds of sources we might consider. I have selected sources that I think are most relevant to this particular discussion, and we'll share them with you, and we'll invite your questions and responses on them. So the first sources, and Tani, you can begin with the first text page here if you want to share it on the screen. Next page. Is what you see in front of you. I've got a couple of selected sources, this page and the next, with teachings from the Babylonian Talmud. So while your eyes are inevitably reading this, and I'll come to the details of it in a moment, you may have seen this text before. It's been frequently cited in recent years by people studying Jewish diaspora who are interested in the phenomenon of Jewish diaspora. But this is from the Babylonian Talmud. The fact that it is called the Babylonian Talmud, or the Bavli, is not insignificant here. Yes, there was a Jerusalem Talmud, Yerushalmi, or also sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud, after the way historians referred to the territory. It is these days also called the Talmud Shel Eretz Israel, the Talmud of the land of Israel. That Talmud existed before the Babylonian Talmud, but of course it did not become the dominant one. The Talmud, whose teachings and approach come to define Jewish practice through the majority of the Middle Ages into early modernity and to our own day, is the Babylonian Talmud. The fact that its teachings don't exclusively originate in Babylonia, but even the Palestinian teachings in the Talmud come through the lens and analysis of the Jewish community of Babylonia. This means, of course, that they have a diaspora orientation, but it's interesting to see, and that's what we'll see repeatedly in these sources, what do they think of their diaspora? So if you look at the text in front of you, let me just I was covering part of the page. So you can see the first one, Rav Judah in the name of Samuel. And this sounds like a specific piece of halachic direction, but it's actually more significant than that. What's listed as Roman numeral #1 here just says it's forbidden to go forth from the land of Israel to Babylonia, so it is forbidden to go forth from Babylonia to other lands. This Talmudic discussion begins in commenting on a Mishnah, the Mishnah, of course, being a rabbinic teaching from the land of Israel about the year 200, that says that if you've got a married couple, if one of that couple wants to go up from diaspora to the land of Israel, or from the rest of the land of Israel to Jerusalem, they have the upper hand, which means in practice that if their partner will go with them, all well and good. If their partner refuses to go with them, and they want this to be reason for a divorce, and they, that is their choice to make, then if they're the one, let's say it's a man who wants to go up to Israel or to go up to Jerusalem, and his wife refuses to go with him, then he can divorce her and he doesn't have to pay the marriage settlement. So that's what it means to have the upper hand. And then beginning with that Mishnah, there's all kinds of expansion, including this. The sacredness of the land of Israel is in part embodied in the practice, which is a prohibition, that Jews in the land of Israel should not leave the land of Israel. Right now, I must say here that this is a virtually impossible prohibition to practice. Maimonides, for example, records this prohibition in his great legal work, the Mishnah Torah. But as many of you will know, Maimonides, of course, went to the land of Israel, spent a little while there, seems to have been terribly bored, and went to Egypt. So he ignored his own legal advice. The reason I reference that is because, as you can see here, the restrictions pertaining to the land of Israel that designated as a sacred place for Jews are also applied by the rabbis of the Babylonian Talmud to Babylonia itself, which is a way of their saying that this land, Babylonia, is a sacred place for Jews. You define sacredness through boundary building, through making an inside and an outside, through saying we connect to the sacred and you don't go to the profane. Well, they did that with the land of Israel. They do it here with Babylonia as well. Not quite at the level of the land of Israel, at least in this first teaching, because it doesn't say you can't leave Babylonia to the land of Israel. Although I do have to say, in something that I didn't quote here, this same Rav Judah says that Jews are not permitted to leave Babylonia to go to the land of Israel. So if we add that here, then the status of Babylonia in its sacredness to Jews is claimed as being virtually identical as the sacredness of the land of Israel. If therefore Zion means the sacred land of the Jews, then this is a claim for Zion in diaspora. If that needs to be kind of massaged out of this first teaching a little bit, the second teaching leaves no room for doubt. Said Rav Judah, whoever dwells in Babylonia is as though he dwelt in the land of Israel, as it says, Ho Zion, escape, you who dwells with the daughter of Babylonia. This is read by Rav Judah in a very literal way, such that Zion, which is addressed here as though it were a person, is together escaped, meaning left the land of Israel and dwelling with the daughter of Babylonia, which Rav Judah uses in a very literal claim that if you live in Babylonia, it's as though you live in the land of Israel. If Zion is an idealized way of speaking of the promised land, of the land of Israel, we used both of those terms in our answers, in your answers to my survey, as it were, then this again is a virtually explicit claim that Zion is found in Babylon. Okay, now that's not the end of these teachings. I don't want to take a question yet, but take a breath, because we're going to go to the next page and remember what you might want to say or ask about these. And let's go to the next one. So this is, again, of many possible teachings. This is all from a single text and, again, makes interesting claims. Shimon Bar Yochai, who, interestingly, this is a Tannaitic text, a text that allegedly comes from the land of Israel, and Shimon Bar Yochai was a Palestinian rabbi, but, he says something interesting here for our purposes. Come and see how dear Israel, meaning the nation of Israel, is before the Holy One, blessed be he. For wherever they were exiled, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, that is, was with them. When they were exiled to Egypt, the divine presence was with them. And he quotes a verse to prove this. When they were exiled to Babylonia, the divine presence was with them, as it is said. And he quotes, proof of that. So God's presence comes with them to their exiles. And in case you're tempted to read this as mere poetry, the Talmud in its discussion of this teaching goes on to say, where in Babylonia can you find the divine presence? And they give you the Shekhinah's address. Right? You can find the Shekhinah sometimes in the synagogue of Hotzal, says Abaye, and sometimes in the synagogue of Shaf V'Ativ in Nahardea. So I understand this teaching to literalize the claim that the divine presence is actually in Babylonia. And if you want to know where that is, this tells you where to find it. There are more stories that follow that continue this literalization. But if Zion means the place where Israel can most easily and intimately meet God, be in direct contact with God, which once upon a time happened at the temple in Jerusalem, if that's, what Zion means, then you can see here again that Zion has been transferred to Babylonia in a very, very direct way, in a way that may go even beyond that. And this is not explicitly a Talmudic teaching, but it is a rabbinic teaching. The synagogue of Shaf V'Ativ is a very provocative name. It is Aramaic for float and settle. That would be a translation of the Aramaic shaf yativ. And Rashi repeats an ancient tradition about the origins of the name of this synagogue in Babylon, suggesting that it was founded by the exiles at the time of the Babylonian exile, all the way back in the 6th century BCE, when the temple was destroyed and the stones of the temple were brought by the exiles. At least some stones from the temple were brought by the exiles to Nehardea and are the cornerstones, the foundation stones of this particular synagogue. So it's not only the divine presence that's found in Babylon, but the temple itself, or at least parts of the temple, the first temple that is, that are found in Babylon. I don't know how you could get a more direct or forceful I will answer my question by saying we'll see them going forward, but these are very direct and forceful claims for the transfer of Zion, for the slippage of Zion, for the presence of Zion in this diaspora, which for the writers of this tradition happens to be. This is the beginning. It's a very early and important authoritative source, and I invite whatever questions or comments you might have about it.
You Dr. Kraemer, just cut out for 1 second in the end. You said which in these sources happens to be, and then your sound cut out for a
It
second.
did. These sources happen to be as bold and direct a statement of the presence of Zion in diaspora that we can imagine, or some such statement is what I made.
Great. Okay. There are a few questions about the presence of God, so I'll read those together if that's okay.
Sure, please go ahead.
With the idea that the divine presence is would the idea that the divine presence is everywhere be possible if the temple still existed? Someone else wrote, I thought that in Judaism the divine presence is omnipresent. Is this wrong? In fact, it is my sense the divine presence is in each individual. To give a specific location is analogous to idolatry. Those are some God-related.
Oh, okay. Okay. I love theology works here since we are talking about the divine presence. To take the second question first, or the second, I don't know how many questions you put together, but what you articulated as the second, it's always only partially correct and therefore always partially incorrect to make a claim about a single Jewish belief of anything. Right? Jews have been around and Judaism has been around for a very, very long time. No tradition would survive the centuries if it didn't change and adapt, and if it weren't open to different influences, which whether it likes it or not will happen anyhow. I mean, all traditions that survive will be open to a variety of influences, cultural, religious, and otherwise. And so God is imagined often in biblical texts, in rabbinic texts, less so, but certainly in biblical texts, as having a home, as having a location. When you've got a statement like Shimon Bar Yochai, I mean, I don't know how you could get more explicit than that. You know, wherever they went into exile, the divine presence followed them. Shimon Bar Yochai was a very important Talmudic rabbi, and therefore what he says certainly bears weight, carries weight in a Jewish context. Does he seem to suggest that before exiles, the divine presence is confined, or at least relatively more powerfully located in the land of Israel, even in Jerusalem, even in the temple? I think he does. So to those of you who are thinking about this, you know, that question, I mean, actually, interestingly, it ties into the first question, which was, if the temple hadn't been destroyed, would we think of God as a universal God who is present everywhere? I don't know, right? And certainly, you know, the nuance, the balance of that might have been a little bit more difficult. Prophetic statements going back to the first period of the first temple, late first temple period, the so-called great monotheistic ethical prophets, they certainly had a sense that that the divine presence extends beyond the boundaries of the promised land. Ezekiel in particular when he goes off to Babylon, right? So this is centuries before the rabbinic teachings. He witnesses, he experiences the active divine presence in a way that no human being, as far as we know, has ever experienced that divine presence. He experiences it not only back in the land of Israel, but in Babylon. So there's a tradition to this, but I wouldn't jump to the conclusion. I think it's important not to jump to the conclusion that the Jewish view of God is that God is everywhere. That may be more common as a post-biblical theology and even a post-rabbinic theology, but it's certainly not the Jewish view. And when we read these sources, we're going to see other views expressed.
Thank you, and props to the person who raised Ezekiel's prophecy in the chat. So maybe just one more. One person wrote, these first two teachings taken together suggest that the two communities, Babylonia and Jerusalem, should stay separated from each other. Very troubling. I don't know if
I don't understand that question, actually. Why should they stay separate from one another?
That was how this person
Heard what the sources said?
You want to clarify?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see that. I mean, we know that. I mean, the best place to sort of see what happened, at least in the rabbinic world, is to look at the two Talmuds. There are teachings of Babylonian rabbis in the Jerusalem Talmud. There are many teachings of Palestinian rabbis in the Babylonian Talmud. They maintained communication. They maintained relations at least up to the early 4th century. When we don't, for reasons we actually don't know, the contact seems to have broken off. Was there competition between them? There certainly was. We see evidence of the competition both early in the Talmudic period, meaning 3rd century, and late. And after the Talmuds were finished, there was certainly abundant competition between the two communities, Babylonian and Palestinian, and ultimately the Babylonian community won in terms of its authority. But I don't think that they're calling for that breaking apart, well, except, let me just, excuse me, add one little detail here. That Rav Yehuda, who was mentioned in the early teachings, he was a real, enthusiastic zealot for the centrality of Babylon. And he's the one actually who said that Jews are not permitted to go from Babylon to the land of Israel. Jews in Babylon should stay in Babylon as far as he's concerned until the Messiah comes, of course. I mean, he, supported messianic Zionism, the return to Zion of Jews at the time of Messiah, but condemned explicitly any return of Jews to Zion before the Messiah would be sent. So does that cover it, Julia?
Yes. I mean, there are always more questions coming in, but I think it'd be a good time to continue.
Okay, good. So let's go on. So the next thing you'll see, and Tana, you can put up the next page with Samuel Uskwe. We've made a very large chronological jump here, although the reference to Rashi that I made a few minutes ago at least fills in part of it. Uskwe is a very interesting individual. I mean, what we know of him comes overwhelmingly from a book that he wrote, which I'll hold up here. You can find this online. I don't know if it's still published, actually. I've got an old copy of it, English translation, translated from the Portuguese by Martin Cohn. It's called Consolation for the Tribulations of Israel, as you can see on the page in front of you. Uskwe is from a Sephardi family that was expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, from Portugal. He settled, I mean, he did some traveling around. Ultimately, he settled in Italy, though he spent time in Turkey as well, important time in Turkey. And the book is a very interesting book. For those of you who can get a hold of it, I recommend it to you as a kind of, I mean, it's entertaining in a variety of unexpected ways. He's addressing the generation of Sephardi Jews who have recently been expelled from Iberia, and he seeks, as the title suggests, to comfort them for their very, very painful recent experiences. The way he does this is by creating a fictional Jacob, right? Jacob, the forefather, who engages in conversation. This is built as a kind of dialogue. And the book as a whole takes the shape of a massive compilation of all of the sufferings of Israel. I mean, if you are looking for the most complete record there is of the expulsions and persecutions and sufferings of the Jews until the 16th century, that is to say, until Usque's time, I recommend this book very highly. It's very, very interesting from that perspective. But what's interesting when you read it, and I'm just going to give this to you as a kind of formula, again and again and again, there are a few exceptions to this, but this is the overwhelming pattern. When he's describing an incident, a chapter of the suffering of the Jews, he typically begins in the following fashion. He says, you know, Jews came to such and such a land, and they flourished there for many years. And they were accepted and da-da-da-da-da. I mean, right? And so begins, and then he says, but at one point, the following happened. Right. And often the following happened is about a local ruler who becomes jealous of a local Jew, or a local ruler who falls in love with a beautiful Jewish maiden, and, you know, reaches out and wants to marry her, and things like this. And inevitably these go astray, go awry, and it results in a persecution. But if you add up the number of years, even according to this accounting, that Jews suffered, and compare them to the number of the number of years that Jews flourished, even in this totally comprehensive index of Jewish suffering in their various diasporas, there is no doubt that Jewish flourishing, just quantitatively, far overwhelms Jewish suffering. It's an interesting perspective. I invite you all to go see it, or meaning, you know, to look at the text. With respect to the current question, near the end of the dialogue, near the end of the book, Usque comes out of the pattern that I just described. Jacobo, Jacob, comes out of the pattern I just described, and just articulates why Jews who have been expelled from Iberia, why Sephardi Jews who have come, primarily, he's talking about Turkey, he talks about Italy as well, but Turkey is his central interest here. Why should Jews not be so upset about this? Where can they find comfort if they understand things well? And he gives a series of explanations, most of which aren't relevant. But in the midst of this, he says what you see on the screen in front of you. So you will rise to a higher degree of consolation for your recent expulsion, for the recent suffering, in the great nation of Turkey. Right? This is Ottoman Turkey, of course. This country is like a broad and expansive sea, which our Lord has opened with his rod of mercy. So you can see God here is in the position of Moses, who stands by the edge of the Red Sea, right, parting the waters, as Moses did for you in the Exodus from Egypt, so that the swells of your misfortunes, the sea, right, the churning sea as the misfortunes, might cease and be consumed in it. Here, the gates of liberty, meaning here, Turkey, the gates of liberty are always wide open for you, that you may fully practice your Judaism. They are never closed. Here you may restore your true character. This is a sublime mercy from the Lord. He has granted you such abundant freedom in these realms that you may now take the first step toward your belated repentance. And, you know, here you're living so well that it pays to sit back and ask, you know, what got you into the mess of diaspora in the first place all those many centuries ago. Think about the answers that we gave before, right? Some of the answers. So I'm coming back to my list here. You know, Zion is a place where Jews flourish, where they in peace. It's heaven on earth. It's, you know, where the collective identity and spirit of Jews will be found, will be realized, and so forth. And compare that to what we have here, the gates of liberty, always wide open, right? We've been delivered here. This is literally a site of redemption. Just as the children of Israel left Egypt to go to the promised land, so Iberian Jews left what became their Egypt and came through into their new promised land, whereas it's Turkey. And all of this is on account of God's love. That's what mercy means, God's love, so that their true character, their full character, their full practice of Judaism may be enacted. Now look at the second part of this comment. This is actually a little bit earlier in this section, but I thought topically it belonged later for our purposes. So there's a city, Thessalonica, in the Turkish kingdom, which formerly belonged to the Greeks. It's now in Greece. And in our days, it is a true mother city in Judaism. Mother city is Jerusalem and therefore Zion. Let there be no mistake about that. For it is established on the deep foundation of law, right? If a Jewish home, if the Jewish homeland even is the place from which law, from which Torah emerges, if Zion is the place from which Torah emerges, then what he's just said is that Zion is in Salonika, and it is filled with the choicest plants and most fruitful trees presently known anywhere on the face of the globe. So not only is it Zion, it's actually the Garden of Eden, as you can see here, right? This is virtually explicit. These fruits are divine, in case you had any question. The majority of my children who have been persecuted and exiled from Europe have taken refuge in this city, and she embraces them and receives them with as much love and goodwill as if she were Jerusalem, right? Salonika is Zion. Salonika is Jerusalem, the old and ever pious mother of ours. Is that this anticipates the answers you suggested before virtually fully. It's a remarkable statement. So I open up for your thoughts, your questions, your comments. There's a lot to kind of bite into here. So what do you think?
I didn't have any responses yet to what you had just written. Although I personally had a response.
Okay, listen, you're welcome to participate too, Julia. And we always listen. It sometimes takes people a little bit of time, and we're always happy to give them a minute of silence to, let them think about it. But go ahead.
In one line in that source that stood out to me. Now I'm forgetting exactly the formulation, but it was something about kind of fully living or practicing your Judaism.
Yes. Yeah. The gates of liberty are always wide open for you, that you may fully practice your Judaism. They are never closed.
So, one of the things that's one feature of my own, lovingly very complex relationship with Israel over the course of the last several decades has been, at times a sense of rejection as an egalitarian Jew, let alone as a conservative rabbi, as a female rabbi, and that that line stood out to me as something where, right, there's a way in which, and I think there are other categories of people as well, people who kind of want to be fully in their own identity and be Jewish in the way they want to be, can sometimes be more comfortable in other places than the current state of Israel, because of all kinds of political issues there. So I don't know, just a comment there that it makes me wonder. It makes me reflect that sort of in any given period of time, right, there are conditions in the land of Israel that may or may not make it
for sure.
home.
No, I think what you're saying is very important. I mean, obviously what's said here, much of it could be said regarding Jewish life and in the United States, and which isn't to deny that there obviously is anti-Semitism and so forth, but the quality and freedom and openness of Jewish life here has been at least quite remarkable. And I don't think it's a mistake that if we go back to Jewish publications in the early 20th century, there were many Jewish newspapers, many of them Yiddish, but not only in Yiddish, that had cartoons that represented Jewish immigrants as coming into these new shores with Moses standing by the side of the Statue of Liberty with hand raised and, effectively splitting the waters. So the same kind of mythical association that Usque makes here was certainly made, and not once for sure, by Jews coming to these shores.
I'm looking for a comment that kind of encapsulated several, which was essentially, all these other places outside of Israel are home until they aren't. Right, sort of comfort in places like Spain until we're thrown out. That sort of thing. So I guess pushing back on the idea that, right, that a place outside of Israel, or the land of Israel.
Well, I mean, the only way that would get in the way of describing, say, Turkey, Salonika, as Zion, is if one of your definitions of Zion is that it's a permanent and immovable place, right? If Zion is not a permanent, immovable place, and in these teachings it clearly is not, then there's no contradiction between the fact that a place is home till it's not, and a place can be Zion at one point and won't be Zion, a generation or two from now. That's not a contradiction, though I certainly understand the question. Though I would go beyond that and say that actual Zion, historical Zion, was also a home for Jews until it wasn't. Right? I mean, let's be honest. There's nothing to distinguish the real Zion from these Zions. In that respect, the first place Jews were ever kicked out of, right? It was home until it wasn't, was Zion. Jewish presence was insignificant in Zion from the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era until the 20th century of the Common Era. Until the First World War. The population, I'm going to get the order of magnitude here. I might get the specific number, but there was something like 40, 50, 60,000 Jews in Palestine, at the outbreak of this First World War. I mean, it was at most 1/10 of the population, and it had already expanded considerably by that point in the 19th century. If we were to go back to 1850, you would find the smallest numbers. So, Zion was home until, for many, many, many centuries, it wasn't. I don't see that as standing in the way of the claims that are being made here.
I think that's a very helpful distinction and emphasis, and maybe one that's counterintuitive because there's this, someone just wrote in the chat, we are a nomadic people forever in search of Zion. There's this sense of Zion as like something that we sort of always have been longing for thousands of years. So you think of it as there's something permanent in that, like the longing is permanent.
Yeah, the longing is permanent. No, totally right. But there's actually, before you go on, I have to comment on that. There is a series of stories, short stories, that were put together before his death by our late colleague here at JTS, Alan Mintz. It's Agnon stories on the city of his origins, Bukacz, the Polish city. And the Bukacz stories begin with the origin story of Bukacz. Now, Bukacz, you can look it up online. You can find its actual history in Wikipedia and other such places. It's got a normal early medieval history. But when Jews thought about Bukacz, they thought it was founded as a Jewish city. Right. And the way they tell the story, the way Agnon tells the story, is that you have a group of Jews who set off to find the Holy Land. But they're traveling through Europe, heading east. Probably like many Jews of their age, they had a bad sense of direction. So they're heading east, and winter comes, right? I mean, it starts to get cold because in that area of the world, the winter comes early, and they settle, and they're welcomed by the local Gentiles and given provisions, and they set up a community which develops into the city of Bukacz. So that perfectly encapsulates this whole notion that Jews search for Zion, but on the way, you settle and you found your own Zion. And there is no doubt that Bukacz is described even by Agnon, imagine that, right, as a kind of Zion.
Thank you. I just put a link to the book in the chat for those who are interested.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I recommend it to everybody.
We have more questions, but do you want to continue?
Yeah, no, go a little bit farther. We've got time for questions. I intentionally, kept the sources to somewhat less so we would have time for questions and comment.
So it seems that a lot of people, I guess not surprisingly, have read the recent New York Times piece that featured Shaul Magid's book, and folks are asking, is what you're saying kind of in line with the view of diasporism that was shared in that piece and in his book?
No and yes. No and yes. Most of that book, excuse me, is contemporary commentary. It's about Zionism in Israel today. And while we have certainly commented on those things because they interest us, you'll notice the latest we've gotten so far is the 16th century, right? Long before Zionism. So, he's making a contemporary argument. He references actually, only in very peripheral ways, some of the teachings or material here. But I would say that, I mean, I would stick with the title of his book, The Necessity of Diaspora. And I would say that if one examines the wealth of Jewish sources on these matters without prejudice, one will arrive at the conclusion that traditional Judaisms, not in any singular way, but in multiple ways, but traditional Judaisms certainly saw diaspora as essential, as a necessity, as where God wants us to be in this time in our history. And they all thought that we should not return to Zion, meaning to the land of Israel, as a real physical entity until the Messiah would come. That was the view of every traditional Judaism. And I mean, we can think about that the way we want, but I think one of the important things about that recognition is that it emphasizes for us how radical Zionism was at its origins. We take it for granted, and it's been recast as relatively traditional. There's nothing traditional about Zionism. It is a modern phenomenon, and it is radical at its origins. And speaking personally, I applaud that. I think that we lose something when we don't remember how shocking Zionism was at its roots.
Thank you. People have just thrown out a few examples, which I'll mention
Sure.
just in case you want to respond to any of them. Someone mentioned Vilna, places that have been thought of as
Jerusalem's of, right.
Someone wrote about the reform movements, Berlin as the New Jerusalem. Someone commented humorously that our medieval commentators should have a career as a relocation agent. And someone also asked if there are contemporary texts describing New York as Zion. Those were kind of a few locations.
You don't have to. All you have to do is look around at the number of Israelis here, and you'll know the degree to which it is Zion. So I mean, thank you for stealing my conclusion away from me, by referencing all the other places, that were called the Jerusalem of, of this and that and the other. I'll come back to that at the end, but I think that to think in that way is actually very helpful here. Okay, let's go on to the next thinker. Very, very important to hear. We're not jumping chronologically very far, but this is a very, very important thinker, Maharal of Prague, who flourished and taught in the latter half of the 16th century. So, roughly a half century after what we were just looking at. I would remark here, since the question of Shaul's book has come up, that he has a chapter not addressing the Maharal, but addressing someone who addresses the Maharal. This is a modern religious Zionist thinker who's become more and more influential since his death, who is commonly known as Shagar. And Magid has a nice chapter on Shagar. In my book, I also address Shagar. You'll see it at the, when it comes out, but a different part of Shagar's teaching. But Shagar came back to the Maharal. He was very influenced by the Maharal of Prague. I do have to say as a footnote that that Shagar's son married my niece in Israel. So I met him. I met him only once, but I met him at the wedding of my niece to his son and had a lovely Shabbat wedding weekend, being able to share all kinds of things. But sticking with the Maharal of Prague, Maharal is a very complex figure. Is probably, in a weird way, best known as the alleged inventor of the golem. The legend of the Maharal creating the golem didn't develop until generations after the Maharal died. This was not something that the Maharal claimed or even would have known of. But the Maharal was seen as a kind of mysterious magical figure, which led to the association of the legend of the golem with him. He was a brilliant but unsystematic thinker. Unsystematic because he was very eclectic. He was informed by mysticism. He was informed by all traditional fields of Jewish learning. He certainly read science of his day. He read philosophy. It was all self-taught. So that leads to the lack of, discipline in his writing of it. But as I say, it's quite brilliant. And he has this one work called Netzach Yisrael. You've got a translation of a section here where he comments at great length on the question of the future redemption of Israel. Netzach Yisrael means the eternity volume that is devoted to redemption. And in his commenting on redemption, he also therefore comments at great length on diaspora. And here you've got sections from kind of the meat of his teaching on diaspora that relate most directly to the question of where do Jews belong. And if one of the definitions of Zion is it's the Jewish homeland, it's where Jews belong, then this is the most relevant part of the Maharal's teaching to this discussion. So let's just look at it, and then we will once again open for discussion. Now, a little bit of background. You can see the first words that I quote from chapter 24 of this work are, if Israel had a special land, and then he says in a way that sounds contradictory, since they left the land that was special to them, right? What this means is that he describes, going back to the very beginning of this work, chapter 1, he uses medieval science, which was essentially the same as ancient science in these respects, and says that everything has a natural place, that something cannot survive, cannot be sustained, cannot live in a place that is unnatural to it. And if it survives for a long time in a place that you thought was unnatural, right, that's proof that it was natural. So he talks about the Jewish people and the promised land, the land of Israel, Zion, and says that this is the natural place for Jews. But then he goes on, all of this is before what we're about to read. And then he goes on and he says, you know what, but we actually blew it. And even though it was from God's original plan natural for Jews, it became unnatural. And redemption, by definition, since redemption will ultimately require the intervention of God in common history. Redemption doesn't happen naturally, right? That's the anti-Zionist part of this. Although Maharal has been quoted both by Zionists and by anti-Zionists, because if you quote selectively, you can easily support both. But in any case, at this point, redemption will be unnatural. And what that means is that at the current point in history, 16th century, 20th century, until the Messiah comes, the natural place for Israel is diaspora. So when he begins here, what he's saying is, if Israel had a special land as it in its diaspora, as it once did in the land of Israel. So if Israel had a special land, since they left the land that was special to them, so they once had a special land, they've been exiled from that land, and now the question is, in their exile, do they have a special land, right? He goes on to say, this would be their loss. It would not be good for Jews to have a single special place. It's certainly not in diaspora. But they are scattered throughout the world, and God did not give them a special land. Again, in the strictest sense, this means in diaspora, though I think it has implications beyond that as well, for any special land before the Messiah comes. But let's take it at its word, right? And God did not give them a special land. Rather, the whole world is their land. And this is fitting for Israel. For it is already known that everything has a place that corresponds to its qualities. That's the natural that I mentioned before. And since without Israel, the world would not have been created, there's a famous midrash, a famous teaching that says that just what we just read, that the world was created for Israel's sake because Israel would accept the Torah. So since without Israel, the world would not have been created, for this reason, the whole world, which was created on their account, is their place. Therefore, when they were exiled from the land of Israel, they were exiled throughout the world. And if so, even if they dwelled in a particular land, it is not theirs, for they are not in their place, meaning not in their special place, not in the unique place, because the world as a whole is their place. And then he goes on in the next chapter, suggests something even beyond this. So the first claim is a claim for the world being the natural place, the homeland of Israel. But then he goes on and says, and that which the Talmud said, pray with the congregation, quoting from Brachot, there is no doubt that when there is a slight measure of leaving exile, as when Israel and community prayer unite and are no longer divided, that is considered their leaving exile. For in their exile, they are scattered among the nations. And when Israel unites, this is considered to be their leaving exile. Now, as you'll see when we go forward here, this last teaching from chapter 25 is the beginning of a snowball that rolls, and collects more and more snow, connects more and more teachings in a similar sort. But it's actually very kind of matter of fact, pragmatic. If exile means to be scattered, then to unite is in its way a leaving of exile. And so what he says here, as you can see, is that there are many ways that Israel unscatter. One of the ways we unscatter is when we get together in our synagogues. The very meaning of the word synagogue is where the community gathers, Beit Knesset, the house of gathering. So since Jews gather together in the synagogue, what this means is that leaving, being outside the synagogue and coming together with the community of Israel in the synagogue is tantamount to leaving exile. Diaspora, the world, is the natural place of Israel. It is the proper homeland at this point in history for Jews. And besides, Jews are not stuck in exile even in our dispersions, because when we gather with other Jews, that is tantamount to leaving exile. Provocative statements, I think, in light of our assumptions, but I hope you'll agree, very interesting. And I'm curious about what you think.
Thank you. Lots of important comments, and I think a number of them also are anticipating Professor Eisen's session next week, kind of asking where are we at home today? Is Israel our kind of our where we feel at home? Where are we in exile? What is America? So all folks asking questions along that thread should come back next week. There was a comment a little while back about the idea. I hope I understood this person's comment correctly, but I think the assertion was that there's a striking denial in the idea that we're so portable, that kind of our practices and our communities where we make them really make us a people without the opportunity for self-determination in a specific long-term permanent place. I think that's
So someone was arguing that we're not as portable as we might believe, and therefore we need a center.
I think so.
Okay.
And yeah, and I mean, and they're just yeah, a lot of comments about how we, in the examples that you've raised and others, about how the feeling of comfort and safety disappears when Jews are not kind of, seen as useful or advantageous to those in power in that place.
I mean, sometimes that's true. Other times it's not. Here, I'll make a few comments, both referencing the tradition and making a couple of historical comments. Of course, I don't go out on a limb when I say that Jews living in the land of Israel today don't feel like they're living in so much comfort and safety. Comfort and safety, I don't know how rare a human commodity is through history, but it's not as present in human experience as we wish it has been or would be. Interestingly, on the portability of Judaism, the reference I'm going to make here is to Judah Halevi. Judah Halevi is probably best known to many people, the great medieval Hebrew poet. If people know anything about Judah Halevi, they probably know the line from his poem, my heart is in the east and I am in the end of the west. Libi b'mizrach v'anochi b'sof ma'arav. Beautiful statement. He longed to go to the land of Israel. He dreamed to go to the land of Israel late in his life. And the reason it was late in his life was because he met his death when he arrived in the land of Israel, under circumstances that nobody knows. But he did go to the land of Israel, went to Egypt, spent some time in Egypt, then went on to the land of Israel where he disappeared. But in his great philosophical work, the Kuzari, he says that Jews in our diasporas are far better off than royalty in the same lands, that they look beautiful, but they're merely marble statues, that their gods are not gods, that their powers are not powers, and so forth. And we have got Jews wherever we are, and this is his claim for our portability. We have got God's commands and God's Torah that can be studied and enacted anywhere. There is nothing more portable than the Torah and its system. It can be the way we eat, and it could be the way we spend our Sabbath. It can be the way we study and so forth. And it is this, of course, that has enabled Jews to survive wherever we have found ourselves, and even in the times that we've been forced to go from here to there throughout history. This is Judah Halevi, right? The medieval Zionist making a claim for the portability of Israel. And I don't see any reason to disagree with that. In terms of a place of peace and comfort, let's be less, let's say these things with greater hesitation than we've said them in the past, right? If you think about it, right? So you will frequently find statements about Jews in our scattered lands as threatened, as persecuted, as oppressed, as not being citizens, as not controlling our own affairs. How many human beings had safety, weren't oppressed, weren't subjugated, and controlled their own affairs? Right? So let's go to Christian Europe. How many Christians in Europe during the same centuries had those privileges? The answer is the smallest number of the elite, of the nobility. Most peasants, most common Christians had no prerogative, had no independence, were constantly exploited by the landowners and so forth. In these respects, Jews often weren't any different than their neighbors. Right? Human life is short and miserable, right? We've heard one version or another of that over and over again, and it's worth bearing in mind. So, when we think about the dream of a safe land, because we were never safe anywhere else. What's wonderful about that is how idealistic it is. What's naive about it is how naive it is, right? Or what's problematic about it is how naive it is, right? Human beings in their homelands are not safe from attack, from persecution, from violence, right? Think of the history of any land you like: France, Germany, Spain, I mean, everyone. Did the fact that the French were on French land protect them from invaders, right? Did the fact that Jews were on their land protect them from invaders? I think we need to rethink these things.
Mm. I think what you're articulating is a big part of part of what has become so scary for a lot of Jews in the last few months, kind of the realization that there is anti-Semitism everywhere. Nowhere is fully safe in a way that we may have known intellectually before because of our history, but feel differently now.
Right.
I'm gonna I know you have more sources, and so I'm gonna hold further.
Okay, so let's do the last ones. The last ones will lead us into a good final discussion, and they're fairly easy to go through quickly. So we've got just a few more sources from three outstanding masters of the relatively early Hasidic tradition. So let me say a word about these individuals. And it is notable that this emerges from Hasidic teachings, and there are more that I could have accumulated here. So Hasidism, as many of you know, originated in mid-18th century Polish lands, what were then, and we would still call Polish lands without restricting them to Poland, since Poland's actual boundaries have changed so often. But it was in its way a populist movement, and it expressed resistance to the yeshiva movement, asserting a more spiritual way that wasn't exclusively focused on Talmud study, a more spiritual way of engaging relationship with God, Jewish life, and so forth. It was, I mean, any of you who have taken tours of southeastern Poland as part of your tours of that land, you may have stopped at certain cities that were very important Jewish, locations, and there were many of them, of course. And typically, the populations, at least of many of those settings, had both the Hasidim and the Misnagdim. You have Hasidic Jews, and you had not such, opponents of the Hasids. But the Hasidic teaching here is crucial. So Elimelech of Lezhansk, which you will find his ohel, his place of burial is in Lezhansk. I remember when I went there with my tour of Poland, it was fun to, sing songs and drink schnapps, but he's far more serious than I appreciated at the time. And in this connection, he teaches, it's said in the Gemara, one who stands outside the land of Israel and prays should direct his heart toward the land of Israel. Now, that is a Talmudic teaching that puts Zion at the center. It says when you pray, you face Zion, you face the land of Israel. But look at what he does to it. So a person who wants his prayer to be heard should have the intention, the kavanah, that he is, as it were, praying in the land of Israel, and the temple is built and the altar is in its proper place. Now, note, none of these is real. This is an act of extraordinarily powerful imagination. When you pray, you should pray as though you were in the land of Israel. Now, there is a land of Israel. You could go there, but you don't need to go there. As though you were in the temple, which doesn't exist. As though the altar is built. So use your imagination to conjure all those things. And it is as if he lives now in the land of Israel. And in this way, he comes to clarity and cleaving to God, to Vekut, praying with complete intention and love and fear, as though he is standing in the Holy of Holies. Now, this last part is just unbelievable. Because, of course, if you lived in the land of Israel when the temple was standing, right, you may have imagined yourself in Zion, but you couldn't go to the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies could only be approached by the high priest on Yom Kippur. And even then, he was putting his life in danger because of the power of the divine at the Holy of Holies. Yet, if you find yourself in Galicia and pray with proper Hasidic kavanah, it is as though you were on the Holy of Holies, right? That is to say, that Zion, and even the most sacred place in Zion, is found in the hills of southern Poland, right? Just extraordinary. To go on, I'll take the comments at the end here, or questions at the end. Menachem Nachum of Chernobyl, right, in a similar or related vein, says even though the land of Israel has a physical reality, it exists. In any case, its essence is spiritual and vital, right? This is typical of Hasidic teaching. And it is life, right, or the life force from the Creator. That's what Zion means. Zion isn't a place, Zion is a force, right? And even though we are outside the land, in any case, we have the quality of the land of Israel, because in all the synagogues and study halls where we pray, where we learn Torah, there flows from the Creator, blessed be He, the life force of the land of Israel. If you pray well, if you study Torah well, that's where the divine force will be. And since the land of Israel, since Zion is about the divine force, then all you need in order to create the divine force and to locate yourself in Zion is to be in that synagogue, to be in that study hall. When one stands in the synagogue or study hall and stands and prays with the thought within the speech, then he is in the land of Israel. That is to say, within the life of the Creator, blessed be He, right? Again, a very, very bold statement. Let's go to the last one. Okay, here Nachman of Bratslav. I mean, he has had far more influence after his life, and even today, far more influence than ever before than he did during his lifetime. You know, you would locate him and his teachings, you know, before and after the year 1800. Crucially, Nachman did go to the land of Israel. I mean, he dreamed of going to the land of Israel, but interestingly, he went to the land of Israel and left, went back to, you know, again, Polish lands, and felt that that's where his Torah and his contribution could be made. So what does he say? A place where Jews have dwelt for a while, even outside the land, has the quality of the sacredness of the land of Israel, the quality of the small sanctuary, quoting Ezekiel's notion for where God goes and where you can find God. So here, this is a very simple teaching. Wherever Jews stay for a while, that's where the land of Israel is. Jews don't need to go to the land of Israel because the land of Israel comes to them. And let me note here, you're talking about, you know, modern Europe, right? Not long after this, I mean, we could go into details, but these communities experience all of the hardships that Jews, often impoverished, experience in these lands, and yet they say these things. This is not because they don't experience the trouble that Jews might face in diaspora. It's because what they experience in Torah and in teaching is more important for them and more protective and uplifting than, at least in their opinion, the land of Israel could ever be. You can see he says then in another teaching explicitly, sacredness of the land of Israel is now in exile. Listen, I mean, if Jews are exiled, then obviously the sacredness of the land of Israel goes with them, right? And then finally, Israel, the holy nation, sometimes come to places that are very, very far from the holiness of the people in Israel. In our wanderings, we come to places where there has been no Jewish presence, such as a place that originally belonged to idolaters. And even now they may be under the authority of a nation that is distant from the holiness of Israel, but Israel comes there and conquers the place. It's you know, an unsettling word. What it means is spiritually conquer, but nevertheless, and sanctifies it as a Jewish place. If Jews come there, if they practice Torah and mitzvot, they make it a Jewish place. And this territory too has the aspect of the land of Israel. And on account of this, we have the right to conquer the entire world and to sanctify it with the holiness of the land of Israel. Jews don't go to the land of Israel, right, to find its holiness. They make holiness where they are and therefore bring the land of Israel to them. Putting these Hasidic teachings together, I think kind of, I'll speak for myself, kind of, you know, I take a deep breath like, whoa, you know, I mean, I remember the first time that I saw these, I was quite surprised. But you can see they make precisely the claim that I made in the title of this session, which is that we bring Zion to us. So I'm open for final comments and questions, and I'll make my own final comment when I respond to that.
Thank you. I think those texts really drove home your point. So I'll share a couple general questions and comments, but one person asked specifically about that word conquer at the end of the last source. Should we understand that to mean kind of flourish or something?
Well, I said spiritually conquer. I think that's what he means. It does use the word kavash. I mean, it's the Hebrew word for conquer. So you can do with that as you like. Yes, I admit it's a little bit troubling.
So I've been sharing a bunch of kind of pushing back sorts of comments or questions, and I'll share one more in a second. But I wanted to acknowledge that a lot of what you've been sharing really does resonate with many people who have been making comments throughout about.
But pushing back is more interesting. So let's end with that.
No, but to affirm also that the idea of diaspora and exile as spiritual and faith and community is what defines home has spoken to a lot of people also. And just one interesting thing that I noticed in the comments, there's kind of a thread where I think a lot of people feel that coming together in community is what creates a religious and spiritual home, and kind of the opposite of that kind of keeping the faith and the practice is what creates a communal home, sort of which begets which. And of course, both can be true as well. Well, so the sort of pushback question is, were they saying this only because they, out of necessity, because they didn't, you mentioned that, you mentioned those who did go to Israel, to the land of Israel, but so many people didn't have the opportunity to go to the land of Israel. So should we sort of bracket the significance of some of these sources by this was the only way they could think of Zion because it's all that was.
Well, listen, I would say two things on that. Number one, most of the things that people say is because they had to say them, whether they recognize it or not, right? Whoever the commentator is, whoever it is, I don't care where the teacher is sitting, right? Today in teachings about Israel or diaspora, what they're saying is because, they have to say it for whatever complex set of reasons that's the case. But no, I mean, listen, they could have gone to the land of Israel if they wanted. Right? They were at home where they found themselves. It's not like they were hanging out there, and waiting for the opportunity, unless the Messiah came, right? But they were living at home in these places. You can see that spirit easily and obviously in the Hasidic teachings. But Jews thought of their homes through the ages as homes, even if they recognized that those homes might come to an end, which wasn't a contradiction with their being homes when they found themselves there. It's not as though Jews were always living with their bags packed. Yes, I know, the Holocaust has affected us for obvious reasons very, very deeply. And I know people, both survivors themselves or children of survivors, who speak either literally or figuratively of always having their bags packed. Right. And I understand that, and we could comment that in the more recent modern setting, but that's not the way Jews lived. Right. I mean, Jews were at home where they found themselves. I don't really hear this as a pushback. Right. I just think, that it requires a little bit of broadening and clarification. Do you have a final question, or I have one more comment I'd like to make, actually?
Why don't you go ahead and make it?
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing I want to end with is just simply to say that, listen, we all have our own individual opinions. What I'm presenting here, might influence you, might inspire you, might not, right? There's no denying that these teachings are part of the tradition, right? I don't believe I've gone out on a limb in that side of anything that I've said. I do want to say, though, now I'm speaking as a post-October 7th American Jew, who's worked at the Jewish Theological Seminary, studied here for my entire career, that I believe that there's no going back with October 7th. I think our world has been changed. We will have different interpretations of what that means. We will argue about it. We will fight about it. But I really do believe that its implications are vast and powerful, and I do not believe we can go back. And the reason I describe it that way is because one of the things that will have to be reconsidered is the question of the relationship of diaspora to the state of Israel. And I think it's important, therefore, for those of us in the diaspora, as well as those in the land of Israel, to study the diaspora tradition of Judaism, because it's a very, very important part of our tradition. And it's impossible to understand Jews and our history without taking diaspora seriously and understanding the ways that it was literally in our blood and in our souls. And so I think that, amongst other things, this will become part of the conversation going forward.
I want to acknowledge that in the comments there are many people who have felt very kind of centered and comforted by what you've presented, and also many people who feel very unsettled and disturbed. And it's just a statement about where we are in this moment. And I want to thank you for teaching such provocative texts. I know you don't tend to shy away from that, but I think that
but I don't know why. I mean, the irony is, I don't know why they should be provocative, even though, of course, I fully understand why they're provocative, but they shouldn't be.
they're the right texts for this moment, and I think you've given everyone quite a lot to think about, and I think some incredibly important context, kind of over a whole sweep of Jewish text and civilization and history for the moment that we're in. So thank you so much for starting our series in that way and teaching us today. And I do want to ask people and encourage people to join us again next week, where Dr. Eisen will be looking more directly at the present moment. His session is called "Where Are We Now? Rethinking Exile, Diaspora, and Home in Israel and America." So it will really be a strong follow-up to today's session. Thanks to everyone for joining us. And just a quick heads up that we are trying a quick experiment. We when we close out of the or when you close out of the Zoom, you are going to get a very quick survey. You're not required to fill it out, but we would love for you to share your feedback, as your experience of our learning programs is really important to us to know about. So thank you for joining again today. Thank you again to Professor Kraemer for teaching.
Bye-bye. Nice to see some of you, at least. Bye-bye.